The drumbeat of war on the frontier. The first clash that sparked a nearly decade-long war between two empires in the New World. In May 1754, the dense forests of the Ohio River Valley were at their greenest. Morning mist still clung to the treetops. To demand that the French withdraw from the Ohio Valley, land claimed by both the British and the French. The French had already built the formidable Fort Duquesne and refused to retreat. Washington returned home empty-handed, but tensions had only just begun. Soon after, he was sent again, this time not to negotiate, but to seize control of the region. The French branded Washington a murderer who had violated peacetime. But between two civilizations, each hungry to dominate the New World, what began as a skirmish in the woods evolved into an imperial war. The opening shot of the French and Indian War. The North American theater of the wider 7 Years' War, strategically vital not just for fur trading, but as a key inland corridor across the continent, obscuring the movement of a small troop of young soldiers pressing deep into disputed territory. Leading them was a 22-year-old colonial officer, George Washington. Washington and his Native American allies, the Shawnee and Mingo, under the leadership of Chief Tanaka Risen, ambushed a small French scouting party. The skirmish lasted less than 15 minutes, but ended with shocking consequences. Ensign Joseph Jomonville, the French commander, was captured and then executed by Half King with a tomahawk, despite being held prisoner. The rest of the French troops were either killed or taken. A name then unfamiliar in history. But the mission he was about to undertake would alter the fate of North America. Washington had been dispatched by Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia. The initial diplomatic mission failed. At dawn on May 28, 1754, in a narrow ravine known as Jumonville Glen, Washington then hastily built a small fortification called Fort Necessity, anticipating retaliation. On July 3, 1754, over 600 French soldiers and hundreds of native warriors launched an attack amid a torrential downpour. After a day of fierce fighting and dwindling supplies, Washington was forced to surrender, signing a document written in French, unknowingly admitting to the assassination of Jumonville. This seemingly minor incident in the remote American frontier would soon ignite a global firestorm. The British accused the French of aggression. In the forests of the Ohio Valley, the first shots had been fired, not just between two armies, allies and enemies. The map of loyalties in the autumn of 1754. As the vast forests around the Great Lakes turned vibrant shades of red and gold, unease spread across the villages, forts, and rivers of Native America. The leaves signaled the approach of a harsh winter. But the chill in the air came not only from nature, came from the winds of war. A conflict between two European empires, Britain and France, was drifting steadily westward, and native tribes, though not the cause, were being drawn into it. It was a complex, shifting tapestry of influence, loyalties, neutral zones, and contested areas. The Delaware and Shawnee, for example, initially supported the French, but later switched allegiance when British promises seemed more lucrative. In the South, tribes like the Catawba, Cherokee, and Creek were caught between colonial powers and old rivalries with other native groups. Some remained neutral. Some picked sides based on tribal feuds rather than ideology. It told the story of peoples trying to hold on to identity, land, and life itself while caught between the grinding gears of two ruthless empires that promised friendship but rarely delivered it. For generations, tribes such as the Huron, Algonquin, Ottawa, Shawnee, many native warriors fought not for belief or affection, but to defend their homelands, secure trade, or earn prestige and plunder. The tribal alliances that had once mattered so much were quietly dismissed. Treaties were broken, promises abandoned. British commanders who once depended on native allies now viewed them as obstacles. The same warriors who fought shoulder to shoulder with redcoats were soon pushed off their lands and treated as threats. Some tribes were coerced into choosing sides. Those who refused often faced attacks from both. There was no clear right or wrongly calculations made in desperation. And especially the powerful Iroquois had lived, traded, and at times fought across these lands stretching between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. Tribes like the Ottawa, Shawnee, and even the once powerful Iroquois, who had hoped their loyalty would secure their future, now found themselves squeezed into shrinking territories under surveillance and silenced in negotiations. From this betrayal, a new fire was kindled, one that would erupt just a few years later in the violent uprising led by Chief Pontiac. Waves of settlers crossed the Appalachians, cutting down forests, building villages, hunting indiscriminately, and claiming land without asking. To them, land was something to plow, tame, and possess. Many tribes watched their ancestral territories shrink, their sacred rivers polluted, and hunting grounds turned into wheat fields. And yet, not all tribes stood against the British. But with the arrival of Europeans, the old order had begun to unravel. With guns, metal tools, alcohol, and unfamiliar technologies, the white settlers brought not only new opportunities, but also profound disruptions to culture, survival, and power. The French, vastly outnumbered by British colonists, chose diplomacy and flexibility. They didn't build sprawling settlements. Instead, they focused on fur trade outposts scattered along rivers and lakes. They maintained trade and political ties with both France and Britain, always careful not to favor one side too heavily. As France appeared to be gaining the upper hand in the north, the Iroquois began leaning toward the British, not out of loyalty, but as a strategic move to balance power and protect their influence. Forging bonds with native tribes through marriage, trade, and mutual respect. They learned native languages, converted some to Catholicism, and often lived side by side. Tribes like the Huron, Ojibwe, Miami, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples view the French as the lesser threat, not friends, but partners who respected native lands. The British, on the other hand, represented a clearer danger. The Iroquois Confederacy, made up of 6 powerful nations, had long been masters of diplomacy. The political map of North America in 1754 was anything but simple. It was not just red for British and blue for French. This war was not simply about empires, was a survival game played in shadows and smoke. As the war tilted toward British victory in the late 1750s, the sense of betrayal cut deep. In the end, the alliance map of 1754 was not just a map of war, it was a map of hope, ambition, desperation, and tragedy. The spreading fire, a global war by the year 1756. The flames of war that had begun smoldering on the frontier of the Ohio Valley had erupted into a full-blown inferno, racing beyond forests, rivers, and mountains, engulfing continents. What started as a regional dispute between Britain and France over trade routes and forts in North America had now transformed into a global conflict. It would later be known as the 7 Years' War, a war that reached across the Atlantic into Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. It was the first war truly fought on a worldwide scale. In the American colonies, the early years of the conflict had not gone well for the British. French forces, aided by Native American allies, had driven them from key outposts, ambushed their convoys, and even defeated large British expeditions. British settlers built blockhouses, militias drilled in town squares, and rumors spread like wildfire. Native American tribes, once courted and respected, were now often caught in the crossfire or manipulated into proxy battles. The brutal raids and counter-raids between native groups, the French and the British, turned entire regions into wastelands of burned cabins, abandoned fields, and unmarked graves. The disaster at Fort Duquesne, where General Braddock was killed and hundreds of his soldiers were cut down in a wooded ambush, had shaken British confidence. Almost overnight, warships set sail from harbors, and soldiers marched to the rhythm of drums in streets from London to Paris, Berlin to Vienna. A brilliant orator and strategist, Pete recognized that victory in the global war depended on success in the American colonies. Civilians, farmers, villagers, slaves, and merchants paid a heavy price. Ships laden with sugar or cotton were sunk by cannon fire. Native villages were burned during retribution campaigns. French-speaking Acadians were forcibly deported from Nova Scotia by British authorities. Their homes burned, their families scattered. Native peoples, once powerful in their own right, now found themselves weakened. Britain emerged with control over vast new territories: Canada, Florida, parts of India, and many overseas colonies. France's North American empire was shattered. The war had made Britain the world's dominant imperial power, but at a terrible cost. The victory sowed seeds of resentment, debt, and unrest that would soon sprout rebellions, both at home and abroad. Divided and betrayed by the very powers they had hoped to manipulate, entire cultures were upended in the tide of empire. The embers of future revolutions had already begun to glow. Thousands died in cold and hunger, their suffering mostly forgotten by history. He poured men, money, and ships into the North American front, determined to drive the French from the continent. Their navy, stretched thin, struggled to resupply distant garrisons. Their alliances frayed, their treasury strained. In contrast, Britain, though burdened by debt, controlled the seas, supplied its forces well, and had the support of a growing, increasingly unified colonial population. His victories helped keep the continent's attention divided and allowed Britain to concentrate on overseas theaters of war. For the first time, British commanders began working more closely with colonial militias, offering pay and equipment. British regiments were reinforced, new offensives were planned, and a sense of momentum began to grow. The French, though losing ground in North America, still clung to Quebec, Montreal, and the Mississippi Valley. In the Caribbean, fierce naval battles continued. In India, the British East India Company, under leaders like Robert Clive, defeated French-supported forces in Bengal. In Africa, small but bloody encounters decided who would dominate the trade of gold and humans for the next century. In the Caribbean, islands rich in sugar and slaves became pawns in a bloody game. Forts began to fall. Louisbourg, the great French stronghold guarding the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, surrendered after a brutal siege. Fort Duquesne, once the pride of French power in the Ohio Valley, was abandoned and captured, renamed Fort Pitt. British forces, now more coordinated and better supplied, began to push northward. In West Africa, forts along the Gold Coast changed hands as European powers fought for dominance over the slave trade. In India, British and French trading companies backed rival princes in a deadly contest for control of subcontinental riches. Alliances began to shift like tectonic plates. Britain allied with the rising power of Prussia, while France joined with Austria, Spain, and several other European states. What had once been a war for the wilderness became a struggle for empire, trade, and survival on a global scale. Fear gripped colonial towns. Smoke from burning settlements rose like grim signals over the treetops. But the real turning point came in Europe. In May 1756, Britain officially declared war on France. On the high seas, the Royal Navy faced off against the French Navy in battles that would determine control of the world's trade routes. Everywhere, the war looked different, but the stakes were the same: power, territory, and dominance. Back in North America, the colonies braced for further attacks. Yet, something began to change. In London, a new voice rose in Parliament. William Pitt, the Elder, by 1758. That momentum had turned into action. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Prussians under Frederick the Great fought valiantly against overwhelming odds, holding back Austria, France, and Russia. The tide had shifted, but the war was far from over. It was not only soldiers who suffered. As the war raged on into 1760, it became clear that the French were losing their grip on their once expansive empire. Still, the cost was immense. On both sides of the Atlantic, families mourned sons and fathers lost in distant lands. By the time the guns quieted and treaties were signed in 1763, the world had changed forever. The fire had spread end, though the war was ending. Turning the tide, the transformation of the British Empire in 1758. The war in the New World reached a decisive turning point. After nearly 4 years of defeat at the hands of the French and their Native American allies, the British Empire began to transform. Unlike the rigid aristocrats before him, Pitt saw clearly where victory could be found, not in the stalemated battlefields of Europe, but in the colonies. Ineffective commanders were replaced. Young, decisive generals were promoted, most notably James Wolfe and Jeffrey Amherst. Soldiers were recruited from German mercenaries, Scots, Irishmen, and even native allies. The British Army was no longer just numerous. It was agile, battle-hardened, and skilled in the dense North American wilderness. Around the Great Lakes, they seized Fort Frontenac and Fort Duquesne, the site of George Washington's bitter defeat years earlier. The British renamed it Pittsburgh, honoring Prime Minister Pitt. They weren't just retaking land, they were rewriting names, identity, and destiny. He needed a quick, bold, and unexpected strike, and he chose the perfect moment. New France, like a rudderless ship, drifted into chaos. 1 year later, Montreal surrendered. The war had plunged Britain deep into debt that debt would soon demand hard choices. Choices about taxation and colonial control decisions that would, unwittingly, spark another, even more ferocious conflict, the American Revolution. And the rise of British power, signaled a new era. One where gunfire would no longer echo for the honor of European kings, but instead turn against them stealing land, culture, and future. By 1760, all of Canada had fallen into British hands. They lost not only territory, but their sense of imperial destiny. The French Empire did not collapse overnight, but on the red brick walls of Quebec and Louisbourg, the cracks had begun to show. And in that sweeping transformation, the British Empire had shed its old skin, emerging not as a player on the margins, but as a global master. The flag of King George now flew over lands that had belonged to the French crown for over 2 centuries. In the pre-dawn hours of September 13th, 1759, this was more than a military victory. It was a declaration that Britain was no longer a lone island in the Atlantic, but a global empire capable of conquering, coordinating, and ruling from India to Canada, from the Caribbean to Africa. Britain had not only defeated France, it had proven that with strategy, money, and resolve, a nation could shape the future of humankind. Wolfe's elite troops silently climbed the cliffs west of Quebec and appeared on the plains of Abraham. Completely unexpected move. The ensuing battle was swift and brutal, lasting less than an hour. Both Generals Wolfe and Montcalm were mortally wounded. But Wolfe had won. "America is the key to the world," he declared. And a third west along the Niagara River toward France's central communication hub, who laid siege to Quebec, the political, religious, and cultural center of French America. Quebec stood high atop a cliff overlooking the St. Lawrence, defended by elite French troops under the command of General Montcalm. For over 2 months, the two sides locked in a stalemate, battling through fog, drizzle, and relentless bombardment. The objective: crush New France from every direction, leaving no escape. And he acted swiftly, pouring money, troops, and ships into the colonies, while promising to reimburse any wartime expenses incurred by the colonial governments. After 7 weeks of fierce siege, the fortress, once called the Gibraltar of North America, fell. The loss of Louisbourg was not just a military defeat. It was a crushing psychological blow to France. It opened the path to a grand dream, striking at the heart of New France Quebec. The global storm of the 7 Years' War threatened not only the thrones of European monarchs, but also reshaped the map of global power. And on the battlefields of North America, Britain finally found its voice, a voice of gunpowder, gold, and sharp strategy. In London, the young William Pitt rose to de facto control of the British government. On land, British forces were reorganized. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy, Britain's pride, tightened its blockade on French ports, cutting off reinforcements from Europe. French supply ships were captured, troop transports sunk, and coastal fortresses like Louisbourg fell one by one. The war was no longer a string of quiet failures. It had become a symphony of out-assault. In the summer of 1758, Amherst and Wolfe led British forces in an assault on Louisbourg, the gateway to the St. Lawrence River and the key to the Canadian interior. Farther south, British forces were also on the move. In June 1759, Pitt launched an unprecedented triple offensive. One force up the St. Lawrence River toward Quebec, another north via Lake Champlain toward Montreal. The most memorable thrust came from James Wolfe. Wolfe knew that a prolonged battle would only drain British strength. The victory at Quebec sent shockwaves around the world. For Pitt, but behind the triumph lay darker shadows. For the French, the defeat was a national trauma. And for Native Americans, the Allies, the warriors, by the end of 1759, the French and Indian War in North America was essentially decided. But the legacy it left behind was just beginning. The Treaty of Paris, a new flag over an old land. The winter of 1763 settled over North America with a silence unlike any other in the past decade. The forests no longer echoed with cannon blasts, nor did musket fire rattle through the valleys. Smoke from burning forts had dissipated. Canada and all lands east of the Mississippi River were handed over to Britain. French soldiers packed their uniforms and prepared to leave. Catholic priests folded vestments and relics drawn by promises of respect, limited settlement, and shared land. The French, though imperialists in their own right, relying on trade and diplomacy rather than large-scale colonization. The British, however, arrived with a very different mindset. They saw land not as a shared resource. The war had been brutal and expensive, but the reward was vast territory and a sense of imperial destiny. The Treaty of Paris, while ending one war, had quietly started another, this one not fought in forests, but in minds and hearts. In Louisiana, French culture deepened as exiled Acadians from Canada, known as Cajuns, settled along the bayous, turning exile into a vibrant identity. The flags atop forts were different. The accents in marketplaces shifted. The alliances that had once bound empires and tribes unraveled. But deep beneath the surface, the land remembered. Rivers still followed ancient paths. Forests grew where villages had burned. And the people, native, French, African, and English alike, still told stories of what was lost, what had changed, and what might yet come. Colonial merchants dreamed of new lands to trade in, and settlers saw fertile western valleys waiting for their plows. It marked the end of France's empire in North America, the height of Britain's imperial pride, and the beginning of a new era, one of rebellion, revolution, and reckoning. Veterans hoped for land grants as thanks for their service. But when London issued the Proclamation of 1763, banning settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains to prevent further conflict with native tribes, celebration turned to frustration. Colonists who had bled and died for this land, different, louder, and echoing, not just with the clash of empires, but with the cries for liberty, now felt betrayed by their own king, but as a commodity to conquer, divide, and claim. Uncertain whether they would be allowed to preach under Protestant rule, native leaders came to a chilling realization: their autonomy was at stake. Tribal diplomacy had long relied on playing the French and British against each other. Now that one empire stood alone, that balance had vanished. British officials, like General Geoffrey Amherst, openly dismissed tribal alliances and ceased vital, gift-giving practices that had maintained peace. For tribes like the Ottawa, Shawnee, and Delaware, this wasn't just arrogance, it was provocation. French fur traders, whose livelihoods depended on deep alliances with native tribes, and that only by returning to their traditions could they survive. Inspired by this message, a young Ottawa war chief named Pontiac would soon rise to lead a great rebellion, but that storm was still gathering. Watched as British officers marched in, erecting Union Jack flags where fleur-de-lis had flown for over a century. Some French settlers chose to stay, pledging loyalty to a new crown. Others, heartbroken, fled to Louisiana, determined to preserve their culture elsewhere. Spain, which had joined the war late in support of France, surrendered Florida to the British, but received the vast Louisiana territory west of the Mississippi in return. The map of the New World was redrawn with sharp lines, but on the ground, those lines blurred amid confusion, anger, and change. And the mighty rivers once red with blood froze into mirrors of stillness. It was the silence after the storm, for the war that had raged since 1754 was finally over. The Treaty of Paris, signed in February 1763, marked the formal end of the French and Indian War in North America conflict that had, in truth, become part of a much larger global struggle known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. While diplomats in gilded rooms of Versailles and London exchanged signatures and sealed documents with wax. Across the Atlantic, on the edge of wilderness, history was being rewritten, not with pens, but with flags. Never before had its reach stretched so far and so confidently. From the Arctic to the Caribbean, the eastern half of North America now belonged to Britain. But beneath the surface of triumph lay the seeds of coming unrest. Governing this vast new empire would not be easy, and the price of maintaining it would soon spark conflict in the colonies themselves. Under the terms of the treaty, France ceded nearly all of its North American territories. In the forts and trading posts of the former New France, a quiet exodus began. For the British Empire, the victory was monumental. Perhaps the greatest betrayal of all was felt by the Native American tribes. Many had allied with the French as British forts replaced French ones. Rage simmered beneath the frost of 1763. The spiritual leader, Neolin, preached that native peoples had lost their way, corrupted by European goods and alcohol. Back in the British colonies, there was jubilation. At first, in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and Williamsburg, murmurs of discontent began to grow. It was not yet rebellion, but the first cracks were visible. For the French who remained, there was confusion and quiet resistance. In Quebec, Catholic priests petitioned for religious freedom, while French-speaking families resisted British laws. And so, the old land wore new clothes. The Treaty of Paris was ink on parchment in a European palace, but in America, it was a turning point carved in hardship and fire. For though the drums of the French and Indian War had fallen silent, new drums would soon beat across the colonies. The British victory, the first seed of division in 1763. Britain's victory in the French and Indian War seemed to mark the glorious pinnacle of its empire. The Union Jack now flew over vast lands east of the Mississippi River. The war had ended in brilliant triumph, but it had also left behind a massive national debt. The royal treasury was depleted, and the British government was forced to find new sources of revenue. To them, the 13 North American colonies, now safer than ever, needed to help shoulder the cost of defending and maintaining the empire. Its long-standing enemy France had retreated from the region. And after nearly a decade of violence, the guns finally fell silent. Yet, beneath the triumphant surface, to pay off war debts and maintain a standing army in the colonies, a group of young tradesmen, printers, and merchants gathered beneath an old elm tree soon known as the Liberty Tree. They called themselves the Sons of Liberty. Pamphlets denouncing British policies circulated from town to town. Intellectuals, lawyers, ministers, printers began to speak out. In Virginia, Patrick Henry declared in the House of Burgesses, "If this be treason, make the most of it." In Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin penned letters criticizing the tax laws and sent them straight to Parliament. Loyalty to the crown began to waver not out of hatred, but from a growing sense of being dismissed, treated as second-class subjects. For the first time, from Massachusetts to the Carolinas, a shared sense of injustice began to unite the colonies. They organized protests, burned effigies of royal officials, with no right to legislate or control their own finances. But Americans born and raised on American soil were beginning to see themselves as something different. The dense forests of New Hampshire and the swampy lands of Georgia. But something in the air had shifted. The absolute faith in royal authority had begun to fade. In its place grew a new feeling that the people here, after generations, were no longer merely British. The 1763 victory had, perhaps unintentionally, exposed a fundamental rift in the way the two sides viewed power, identity, and autonomy, and called for boycotts of British goods. Parliament passed the Sugar Act of 1764, placing duties on imported sugar, molasses, and luxury goods. This was soon followed by the Currency Act, which banned colonial printing of paper money. Then came the final straw in 1765, the Stamp Act. It required that all legal documents, newspapers, and commercial papers bear a British tax stamp. They believed the victory opened a new era, one of expansion into the vast Western territories. The intent was to prevent conflict with Native American tribes, but for many colonists, it felt like a betrayal. We fought and bled for that land now. The Crown tells us we can't even touch it. Angry murmurs began to ripple through taverns, print shops, and country roads. Now, free of the French presence and ready to be settled. Veterans expected land grants as rewards. Merchants dreamed of new markets, but soon those dreams were doused with cold reality. Invisible cracks began to form, setting the stage for a future where the bond between the mother country and its colonies would begin to unravel. They didn't care about treaties with native tribes. To them, the Western land was a just reward. Some groups, defying the proclamation, packed up their families and pushed westward. They became illegal settlers, facing off against both indigenous resistance and British troops. In London, the British leadership celebrated. Meanwhile, the colonists were also filled with hope. In October 1763, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation, forbidding all colonial settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains. In western Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the frontier lands, farmers and militiamen were furious. At the same time, a new conflict flared over taxes. In Boston, church bells rang out warnings. In New York, thousands of angry colonists stormed the home of a tax official. That night, the house was torn to the ground. But discontent wasn't limited to common folk. From the British perspective, the colonies were merely extensions of the realm. And so, as another summer dawned, the sun rose over the cobbled streets of Boston. They were becoming American. And the British victory, seemingly the glorious conclusion to a long conflict, turned out to be the beginning of a great and irreversible divide.